right, welcome back. In this episode of AP Economics, we're going to be talking about some of the problems with fiscal policy, some of the problems with implementing fiscal policy, problems with fiscal policy itself, and we're going to talk about one of the alternatives to traditional fiscal policy, which is called supply side fiscal policy. Some of the stuff in this screencast is a little bit complicated, so you're going to want to bring your A game and apply a little bit of thought to what's happening here. All right, so here we go. Problems of fiscal policy. The first problem with fiscal policy, or a set of problems with fiscal policy, could be called timing problems. And these are problems in terms of getting fiscal policy right at the right times. And essentially, there's three separate timing problems when fiscal policy is concerned, and we'll deal with each one in turn. The first problem is called the recognition lag. And this is the amount of time it takes for Congress and the president, remember that's who's doing fiscal policy, to even realize exactly what the problem in the economy is. The government collects data, and it takes time to collect that data. And so when the government looks at the unemployment rate or the rate of GDP or the rate of inflation, typically it's looking at what the economy looked like a few months ago or a month ago or some amount of time ago. So it could be that we go into a recession, but the government doesn't even know about it really for some amount of time, some amount of months. And that's called the recognition lag, the amount of time it takes to figure out even what kind of fiscal policy we want to do, given the state of the economy. Now, there's another lag called the administrative lag, and that's the period of time it takes between Congress and the president recognizing what the problem is and then actually doing something about the problem. Because remember, this is Congress and the president acting, and they have to enact laws, and there's this whole legislative process. So it could be that we go into a recession, the government recognizes that after some amount of time, and then it might take months, maybe even years, before the Congress and the president can get together and agree on what it is exactly they want to do, change government spending or change taxes. So at this point, between these two lags, we're already talking months and years, or months and possibly years, between the actual problem, something like recession or inflation, and the government passing the law that it's going to pass to change government spending or taxes to try to address it. The final problem is called the operational lag, and that's the time in between Congress and the president passing a law and that government spending or tax change actually having an effect. With stuff like government spending, the government might decide to spend $1 billion on a road project. That road project doesn't happen immediately. It takes time. It could take months or years to actually build that road. If we're talking about tax changes, again, people don't really pay taxes until April often. They might not even notice that they got a tax cut or a tax increase until that time. And so if you add up all of these lags, the recognition lag, the administrative lag, and the operational lag, it could be the case that perhaps the economy goes into a recession, and by the time all of this has happened, the economy might have come out of a recession all by itself. And now the government might be doing expansionary fiscal policy, for example, when it's not necessary anymore, and maybe pushing aggregate demand to a place in the graph that we don't want to see it. So those are kind of unavoidable. They are problems of timing, and the smaller we can make those lags, the better, but there's really no way around these problems if we're going to have a deliberative process. All right, now the second problem, and I think this is actually a bigger problem, is a political problem. And the political problem becomes clear if you think about what expansionary and contractionary fiscal policies really are. The truth is that everyone loves expansionary fiscal policy, and by everyone I mean voters. Expansionary fiscal policy is more government spending, which people like. They like libraries, they like roads, they like schools. Or it's tax cuts, which people also tend to like. They like to keep more of their money. So it's very hard for a politician to get elected on a platform of contractionary fiscal policy, even if that's what's necessary for the economy. I challenge you to go out and try to get elected to any sort of significant political post by promising to raise people's taxes or cut their benefits or cut spending on programs that they like. And as a result of that, we're almost constantly running expansionary fiscal policy, whether that's what's called for or not. And it's one of the reasons that we've been racking up large deficits and debts over the last number of years. I'll be talking about that more in the next screencast. But if we're constantly spending more money or cutting taxes, the government's going to find that it's going to need to borrow some money, and that's what's been happening. So that's the second problem, and I think that's actually even more significant problem than the lag problems. The fact that just politically, just because people don't generally understand fiscal policy, you have to have taken economics to understand why you might want to do contractionary fiscal policy. Very hard for voters to understand that sometimes it's actually might be a good idea to cut government spending or raise taxes. And as a result, politicians want to get elected, they give voters what they want. The third problem with fiscal policy is the fact that states often are doing the exact opposite thing that the federal government's doing. The federal government doesn't have to balance its budget. So if we're in a recession, they could just borrow money to spend more, or they can cut taxes. Most states have a requirement to balance their budget. And so one of the things that happens, and this happened in the Great Recession of 2008, is that as we go into a recession and the federal government tries to do expansionary fiscal policy by doing things like cutting taxes or raising government spending, the states are doing the exact opposite thing. They have to balance their budget. So when there's a recession going on and everyone's losing their jobs and they stop paying taxes because they don't have incomes to pay taxes on, state governments have to start cutting back their spending. So at the same time in 2008 that the federal government was trying to push more money out into the economy, states were firing people. They were firing police officers and firefighters and teachers. That's less government spending. They were cutting back on road projects and all sorts of other kinds of spending. Um, So this is a problem, and it weakens fiscal policy when done by the federal government if the state governments are constantly trying to do the opposite thing because they have this requirement to balance their budget where the federal government simply doesn't. All right, now we're going to get to the two more technical problems with fiscal policy. They're called the crowding out effect and the net export effect. The crowding out effect, specifically a favorite of the AP economics exam. And these aren't problems with fiscal policy as much as they are effects that are going to happen that wind up weakening the fiscal policy that the federal government tries to implement. So I'm going to take you through the crowding out effect and the net export effect in turn, and I'm going to take you through them step by step. And it is important to understand this cause and effect chain. And if you don't understand it after watching the screencast, I am going to urge you to come in because, again, this is one of the favorites of the AP Econ exam. All right, so the crowding out effect. When the government engages in an expansionary fiscal policy, and I'm just going to use expansionary fiscal policy as an example, but we get something called the reverse crowding out effect when the government does contractionary fiscal policy. So when the government engages in expansionary fiscal policy, it crowds out, quote unquote, other kinds of spending, specifically consumer spending and more importantly, investment spending, which winds up dampening that expansionary effect. To see why, again, I'll bring you through the steps, the cause and effect chain. So in step one, we're going to assume that the economy is in a recession or below full employment GDP. And you know what the government would do at this point. It would run expansionary fiscal policy, and to do that, it would either cut taxes or it would try to raise government spending. Now, either one of those things means that the government's probably going to be running deficits. If the government's spending more money or if it's collecting less money in taxes, it's got to come up with that money somewhere. Now, there's a few places the government could come up with that money. It could theoretically print out money, but there's problems with that, and we'll be talking about those problems in the next unit. So typically what the government does is borrows that money. It borrows it from China, it borrows it from Japan, from the oil producing countries, it might borrow it from us. That has an effect on the demand for money. And we've seen where the demand for money is before. We've seen that in the loanable funds market. So when the government tries to borrow money to do expansionary fiscal policy, it increases the demand for money in the loanable funds market, and as a result of that, interest rates start to rise in the economy. Again, if we go back to the graph of the loanable funds market, you can see why that would happen. When the government comes along and decides it wants to start borrowing money to do expansionary fiscal policy, that's one more entity in this market that's saying, hey, give me money, I want to borrow some money. That's the demand curve in this market. So running expansionary fiscal policy has the effect of shifting the demand for money in this graph to the right. When the demand for money in this graph shifts to the right, it has an effect on the quantity of money borrowed, obviously. You can see the effect there. But more importantly, it has an effect on interest rates. Interest rates start to rise. All right, should be clear enough. Those rising interest rates make it more expensive for businesses mostly, but also for consumers who want to take out loans to take out those loans. It's now going to be more expensive to borrow money for pretty much everyone. So again, going back to that investment demand curve that we've seen before, depending on where the interest rate was, what we're going to see is that it's higher. So let's say that before the government decided to borrow money, the interest rate was at, let's say, whatever, 8%. According to the investment demand curve, there'd be $20 billion borrowed, and that $20 billion would be spent in the form of investment. If interest rates rise as a result of that government borrowing to something like 12%, according to this graph, the amount of investment is going to fall from 20 billion down to 10 billion. Those rising interest rates made big I investment fall. So that reduction in investment and also in consumer spending, because it's also going to be more expensive for consumers to take out loans to buy cars or to take out loans to go to college, is going to have the effect of pushing aggregate demand back a little bit when actually what we want it to be doing is moving to the right. And that's the crowding out effect. So again, in a nutshell, if aggregate demand is too low and the government tries to do expansionary fiscal policy, what it's trying to do is push the aggregate demand curve to the right. So that initial shift there might be what the government's intending to do. The crowding out effect is going to have the effect of pushing that aggregate demand curve a little bit back to the left. That reduction in investment spending or that reduction in consumer spending is going to mean that aggregate demand isn't going to get pushed to the right quite as far as the government perhaps wanted it to. So instead of achieving something like this level of GDP or employment, we might only wind up achieving this level of GDP or full employment, which is better than where we started out. The crowding out effect doesn't destroy fiscal policy entirely. It just means it's going to be a little bit less effective. So again, instead of going this far, we wind up only going that far. All right, kind of technical, but also kind of important, and especially this last part of the cause and effect chain, this little pushback in aggregate demand from the direction that the government's trying to push it in. In the handout, I'm going to provide this little summary of the cause and effect chain. I'm not going to go through it again in the screencast, but I want you to know that there's the resource there for you if you need a little refresher later on as to what the crowding effect does and the steps involved. Okay, now the next problem and the final problem that I'll talk about, also kind of technical, is called the net export effect. And some of this is going to need to be explained towards the end of the year as we talk more about international trade, But for now, I want you to get the basic idea. The net export effect says that when the government engages in, again, something like expansionary fiscal policy, that's going to wind up reducing net exports, which is also going to dampen the expansionary effect of the fiscal policy. So again, to take you through it step by step, the government tries to increase aggregate demand perhaps because there's a recession, and to do so it either increases spending or cuts taxes. Either one of those, again, is going to mean deficits. Where's the government going to get the money? Typically, it's going to try to borrow it. And again, it's going to go to that loanable funds market to borrow the money. That again is going to increase the demand for money and make interest rates start to rise. All of that is the same as the crowding out effect. In fact, the steps are exactly the same up to this point. So again, back to this graph, when the government tries to borrow money, what we're going to see is the demand curve shift to the right. And as a result of that demand curve shifting to the right, interest rates go up. Now here's where it gets a little bit different. Those rising interest rates entice foreigners to put their savings in our banks and other financial institutions. Now you're going to have to think this through a little bit, but imagine what's happening as interest rates are rising in the United States. Let's say you're living in Britain. The banks in Britain may be offering an interest rate of 2%. If you put your money and open a savings account, you'll get 2%. You look over to America and you notice that because the government's doing this expansionary fiscal policy and interest rates are rising, if you put your money in a bank in America, maybe you'll earn 5 or 6% interest. Well, if you're British and you know about this stuff, and lots of sophisticated financial investors do, you're going to say, hey, I'm not going to put my money in a British bank. I want to put my money in an American bank. Now, the problem is that American banks don't want those British pounds. American banks want American dollars. So those British people and everyone else around the world who's trying to put their money as investments in our country are going to need to convert their currency into our dollars. And as foreigners rush to exchange their currency for our currency, one of the things that happens is that our dollar begins to appreciate. And again, we're going to discuss this more in depth towards the end of the semester. For now, I just want you to know the basic layout. We've seen what happens when the dollar appreciates in terms of net exports and also in terms of aggregate demand before. An appreciated dollar is going to make our goods more expensive. It's going to make foreign goods less expensive, imports less expensive. So our exports are going to fall, our imports are going to rise, and as a result of that, net exports, which are exports minus imports, are going to fall. Those falling net exports are going to lead to, again, just like the crowding out effect, a little pushback in aggregate demand, which again is going to weaken that expansionary fiscal policy a bit. So like the crowding out effect, I'm going to offer a little summary slide in the handout and make sure that you're able to work through this cause and effect chain and understand each of the steps. And again, if you don't understand those, I'm going to urge you to come in and get a little bit of extra help with it because it's not entirely intuitive and it does take some thinking through. Alright, so for the final part of this screencast, we're going to talk about an alternative to traditional fiscal policy, which is called supply-side fiscal policy. The detractors of supply-side fiscal policy have called it trickle-down economics. This was really brought to the forefront by people like Reagan, Ronald Reagan, and the detractors characterize it as the idea of making life easier for rich people so that they'll spend more money and that spending will trickle down onto the rest of us and eventually we'll get better off too. The phrase a rising tide will lift all boats has been applied to supply side fiscal policy. That's kind of a crude characterization of what supply side fiscal policy is, and now that you understand the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, I'm hoping you'll more fully appreciate what supply side fiscal policy is actually about. We've seen some of the problems involved in trying to shift the aggregate demand curve. Essentially, this entire screencast has been about those problems. What the supply siders say is forget moving the aggregate demand curve, which is what traditional fiscal policy is. They say we should be focusing on shifting the aggregate supply curve instead. That's why it's called supply side fiscal policy. So, how do you shift that aggregate supply curve? Go back to the determinants of aggregate supply. There's essentially three of them: resource prices, productivity, but that third one was the legal institutional environment. And that's what the supply siders want to change. They want to cut taxes, especially on businesses, and they want to get rid of government regulations that make it more difficult for businesses to operate. So, environmental laws, worker safety laws, child labor laws, minimum wage laws, anything that adds expense to business. They think that by doing those things, they can get aggregate supply to move to the right for a few reasons. If we cut people's taxes and they get to keep more of their money, they're going to save more. And that's going to be more money available in the loanable funds market for firms to use to borrow and invest. If we get to keep more of our money, we have more of an incentive to work and more of an incentive to work harder. We keep more of what we have. And we have more of an incentive to take risks, start new projects, maybe start new businesses. Again, because you get to keep more of what it is that you earn if taxes are lower. So to finish up the screencast, I want to show you very quickly the difference between traditional fiscal policy, sometimes called mainstream or Keynesian fiscal policy, and supply-side fiscal policy. With aggregate demand, the problem is when it shifts, there's usually a trade-off. So let's say aggregate demand shifts to the right. Maybe we do expansionary fiscal policy. And notice here we're just looking at that upward sloping part of the aggregate supply curve. I've eliminated the horizontal and the vertical part for illustrative purposes, but that's okay because again, the economy's on this upward sloping part 99.9% of the time. If the government shifts aggregate demand to the right by doing expansionary fiscal policy, we get two nice effects. We move from this level of GDP and employment to this level of GDP and employment. And that's a good thing, right? GDP going up, employment going up, we like that. The problem with traditional fiscal policy is that even though we get some nice things going on, there's a trade-off, and that trade-off, in this case, comes in the form of inflation. Prices start to rise. If you work the analysis back the other way, aggregate demand shifting to the left, again, we have a trade-off. We would see prices falling, but we'd also see GDP and employment falling as well. Compare that to shifting aggregate supply, and specifically shifting aggregate supply to the right. If we shift aggregate supply to the right, there's that supply shift to the right, basically what we get is every good thing that could possibly happen to an economy happening. Not only do we get that increase in GDP and employment, the same kind of increase perhaps that we would have gotten with traditional fiscal policy, that move to the right, more GDP, more employment, we also don't have to deal with inflation. In fact, in this example, you can see that prices would actually be coming down. So with traditional fiscal policy, there's always this trade-off. There's always getting more of one good thing at the expense of some bad thing. With supply-side fiscal policy, there's no trade-off. In fact, we can get the best of all worlds. And this is what the supply-siders are really arguing for. They're not in and of itself interested in making rich people richer in the hopes that they're going to just spend more and make us all a little bit better off. They think we all will be better off, and we'll be better off without some of the trade-offs and some of the problems that traditional fiscal policy experiences. All right, stopping that one there, and I will see you the next time.
This is a very unusual sight. A sloth in a hurry. It wants to defecate, and the only place it's happy doing that, oddly enough, is down on the ground. It only does it about once a week. But why does it come down to the ground to do it? And why does it nearly always choose to do so in exactly the same place?